So thank you so much for being here for this event, which is part of Launch Your Career in Canada. The webinar today is Telling Your Story, Translate Your Knowledge, Skills, and Experiences into a Canadian Context. My name is Robin Stocky. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a career educator at the UBC Career Centre. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the UBC Career Centre on Vancouver's Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you might be joining us today from many different places with many different histories, and would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I think it's especially always important to do this, but especially important today, knowing that all of you in this room are international students and new to Canada, and there's still lots to learn about the land that we're living and learning on, and how that also plays a part in our career journey within the Canadian context. So I just invite you to do a little reflection on that today as we move through the presentation. Before we get into it, I wanted to talk a little bit about the program that this webinar is a part of, which is Launch Your Career in Canada. It's UBC's annual networking experience, open only to UBC international students, and it's dedicated to supporting your career development. So during this time, you have the opportunity to connect and network with industry professionals through panels and networking settings, discover how to navigate work and research opportunities at UBC, develop job search skills, and learn from alumni who have made a successful transition from UBC to the Canadian workplace. So launch takes place for a series of in-person and virtual events from March 6th to March 17th. So we're in the last little bit of it here. And you can register for any of these events on Careers Online, as I'm sure you know since you're registered for this one today. I did also want to highlight an upcoming event, which is happening this Wednesday, March 15th. It's called My Career Story, and it's an opportunity to connect with UBC alumni to learn about different industries, possible career paths, and really just build your network and get inspired. So you can see on the screen now a few of the panelists who will be at the My Career Story event. So take a look through if there's any companies that you're really excited to learn about that are on there, or if you just want to hear more from alumni who have made that transition, this is a really great opportunity. The space is limited though, so I would encourage you to RSVP on Careers Online to be able to reserve your seat. So hope to see many of you there on Wednesday. And finally, just before we really get into the content today, we'd love if you could scan this QR code or use the tiny URL there, which I believe is in the chat as well, to just let us know that you're here. By filling out the attendance survey, you'll be getting a recording of the webinar, some slides, and a link to our post-event survey for a chance to win one of 6 $25 gift cards. So definitely worth it to sign in, and also helps us to know how many people actually attend these events, so helpful for us. I will give you just a moment to do that. And it would actually be great if I could get you to put a Y in the chat when you're done, just so I can get a sense of how long it's taking folks to do this. Amazing. Seeing lots of Ys coming in. Thank you for filling this out. Appreciate it. Just give a couple more seconds here. Great. Nice to see a couple familiar names in this chat too. Hi. Thanks for coming. Okay. Great. So thank you for filling that out. And don't forget to fill out the post-event survey as well for a chance to win one of those gift cards. So that'll be sent afterwards. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? The learning outcomes for the session today, I'm really hoping that by the end of our hour together, you'll be able to see how your identity informs your career journey. So how do you as a person show up in your career journey, and what does that mean for you? Consider where your skills and your unique experiences are going to be celebrated in the job market. Know where to learn more about some Canadian policies and other employer obligations that exist in the Canadian context. And then we're going to dive into a little bit around resume and cover letter writing. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to talk about some of the principles of effective resume and cover letter writing, make some strategic decisions about what information to include on your documents, and finally be able to design those documents with some intentionality as well. So to do this, we're going to start by exploring our identity or your identity as an international student, discuss how that identity can inform your career exploration, describe some key principles of effective job applications. We'll talk about and look at some examples of the information that you could include on a resume and cover letter, and then explain some of the formatting choices that you can make to highlight key content as well. So let's start by talking a little bit about identity and the Canadian context that you're in. Before we get into it, I really want to talk a little bit about the career development framework. So as you can see on the screen now, there's sort of these 4 different pieces of the development framework. And this is really just a simplified way of thinking about what's important for people and our communities to pay attention to as we think about fostering an environment for you as students to build your career. And the UBC Career Center approach to career development has been informed by this integrated and evidence-based framework that attends to 4 broad domains. So tools and resources, which would be like resume, cover letter, and interview skills, which we'll get into a little today. People and network, so connections to peers, staff, faculty, alumni, other mentors, other people that you meet along your academic journey. Experiences, so the academic, experiential learning, extracurriculars, so those extra pieces that you get throughout your time at UBC, and identity development. So that's an understanding of self and self in relation to others as well. So this includes, exploration and articulation of our values, of our goals and strengths, and our capacities as well. Many aspects of identity, including indigeneity, race, gender, socioeconomic status, disability, and sexual orientation have also been the target of some historical, persistent, and systemic oppression, including forms of systemic barriers to individuals' work and career opportunities and experiences. And there are also unique strengths and perspectives derived from these parts of our identity. So it's really critical that we engage with them and we talk about these factors and really acknowledge the way that they influence our career journeys. There's a positive correlation between a sense of identity and between career agency for students post-graduation, which is why we use this framework, because it's, as I mentioned, an evidence-based approach. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on the identity development piece before we get into some of that tools and resources, but I really just wanted to highlight that this is just one factor of career development, and these all kind of play together. So even after this webinar today, I hope that you'll think about the other sort of components of this and who's in your network and what experiences you're having. So that's something that I wanted to share with you. Okay, just gonna check our chat. Okay, amazing. Okay, so to get started, I'd love to do a little bit of reflection with you. So today, all of you are international students. You're all studying at UBC, but I'd really like to invite you to consider some other intersectional aspects of your identity as we do this work today. So using the annotate feature, which you should be able to see on your options bar, annotate with the little pencil. If you click on that and then go to the stamp function, you can pick any stamp you'd like. And what I'd like for you to do is to stamp the identity types that are most influential to you and how you think about yourself. So I'll give you a moment to do that. So when you think of yourself, which of these stand out as like, this really influences who I am? Great, I'm starting to see a few on there. Okay, it's always interesting to see which of these come up the most with folks. Got most of them circled, I love it. Okay, lots around ethnicity, few around gender, nationality and citizenship for sure, a big one. Education level and academic discipline, I think makes sense that these are influential factors for folks in the room today. I mean, we're all, here studying at UBC and in this context, so definitely important stuff when we consider who we are as a human. I also wanted to ask, before we keep going, is there anything that isn't listed on here that you feel like is a big part of your identity that you wish was represented? And if you do have something, you can share it in the chat. I will ask you to share a little bit in the chat throughout this presentation. And if you ever don't feel like you want to share with your name, you can also message me directly and I can read it out. But I just wanted to offer that as well. Yeah. Okay. So thinking about these different pieces, and obviously there's some that kind of come up a little bit more than others, and that's okay. And it will depend a little bit on the group for sure. Oh yeah, great. Connection to land, place, and people. That's definitely another part of our identity. Hobbies for sure. What do we like to do? Who are we outside of our work or our school? Definitely. Thanks for that, Camilla. So thinking about this, and just in the chat, how do these pieces of identity influence how you see yourself? Oh yeah, and another piece of identity is languages that you speak. Thank you for that. So how do these pieces of identity influence how you see yourself? They shape different parts of your characteristics. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Yeah, so it really is informing who you are as a human, right? Who are you as a person showing up in this space and hopefully eventually in your career as well. Thanks for that. And what about how do these factors influence how others see you? Do you think there's maybe some factors that are more visible than others? Yeah, it's hard to answer. That's fair. And I mean, that's part of the reflection, right? Is to think about like, how do these influence ourselves and how does it influence how others see us? Yeah. Are you over, do they think you're overqualified or too old for a certain job? Definitely. So there might be some assumptions that come along with these parts of our identities. So I think that's a good thing to consider as we're thinking about ourselves as a whole person. Sense of affinity or connection to, love that reframe, Marissa. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe it's easier to connect with someone if you have something like this in common. Yeah, lots of assumptions coming from skin color or things that are more visible, bringing in diversity. Amazing. That's great. Thank you for all of your sharing in the chat. So I'm going to ask you to pause on the annotation for a moment. I'm going to clear this. I'm going to ask you one more question. So thinking again about these pieces of identity, which factors do you think are the most influential to Canadian employers? And just using that stamp function again. Yeah, or in the chat, either way is great. Yeah, the academic discipline is a big one for sure. Helps us to figure out what industry we're going into. Okay, I see a few around nationality and citizenship for sure. Okay. So this is interesting to me to see what is being highlighted here. I think we had a pretty big span on the different parts of our identity when we thought about how it influences us. And I can see that it's definitely a little bit more focused as we think about what employers are looking for, which makes sense, right? Because they're looking to fill a position, so they're going to be looking for certain things. Definitely education level and academic discipline are big, but there are other factors there that are going to influence those decisions around ethnicity, nationality, family status, and age, ability for sure. So thinking about that, what are some things that you'd want your employer to know about you, knowing that they might be looking at these types of things? That you can learn quickly. Yeah, your specific work experience and soft skills, great. Yeah, what's really applicable to them? That you're adaptable, how your skill set is relevant to the job. That's a great one. Growth mindset, absolutely. I don't know how to do that yet, or I haven't tried that yet. Great. Work experience from the country they're migrating from. Yeah, absolutely. I think many of you in this room will have experience that's very unique to Canadian employers because you've done it outside of Canada, right? Your ability to communicate, work as a team, your attitude. Yeah, absolutely. Not that you're not a stereotype, you can get the job done. Thank you for that, Alana. That's awesome. Yeah. So I think really what I'm hoping to showcase here is that there's, we all have our own identities, and then we can think about how those identities are showing up when we are moving through our career journeys and starting to do applications, and that there are some things that we might want to really highlight, and that our identity can really be woven throughout our entire application, right? So some of the stuff might come up right in your resume and cover letter, some might come in the interview, and some might come once you get into the workplace and you're starting to adjust to being in a new team and getting to know the other people that you're working with. Okay, so I'm just going to clear this annotation before we move on. Great. Amazing. Thanks so much for your participation so far. This is awesome. So the next question that I have for you is thinking about that. What are some implications that you think this is going to have on your job search? Thinking about your own identity. How might that impact how you look for a role? Yeah, what cities you use in the search? Absolutely. How do you narrow it down? Do you want to work in Vancouver or elsewhere in Canada or somewhere not in Canada? Which companies to target? Absolutely. Yeah, thinking about how you are going to explain your experience in a way that Canadian employers can understand. Yeah, that's definitely a good one. Thanks for that, Stephen. What else might you consider? Experience you need from the companies. Yeah. Searching for inclusive values. I love that. Thanks, Marissa. Yeah. We absolutely want to work for a company that is going to have similar values to us and is going to make us as an individual feel valued, right? For all the parts of our identity that we've just talked about. Perfect. So I'm going to provide a couple additional questions that you could potentially ask yourself as you're starting to do some of this research. So these are just some samples to kind of get you started. So what policies exist at this company around employment equity, discrimination, disability accommodation? What evidence can you find that indicates that you're applying to an inclusive environment? So a good place to look for that is in the job postings. Often there will be an equity statement in job postings or on an organization's website. Now that doesn't always necessarily mean that that's in practice. So another good option for that is to check out different resources like glassdoor.com or speak to other people in the industry to get a real sense of how that organization is doing. Are they listed online as an inclusive employer, or have they been recognized for diversity? So you can do some research outside of their own organizational website. LinkedIn is another great place to look as well. And do they welcome feedback on whatever it is that they're offering? Because I think oftentimes that can be a benefit to, or give us some insight into the fact that they're open to feedback around other pieces too. When these slides are shared with you at the end, you'll be able to click through on some of these links here. And we've got a few that are on the next slide as well, but the career equity guides, you'll be able to click through and do some more research. And I also just wanted to, before we get into the resume and cover letter pieces, just talk a little bit about knowing your rights in the Canadian context. So recognizing that this context is different from anywhere else in the world, really, because every country is different. There are some policies that exist in Canada that I think it's really important for you to get familiar with and know about before you start applying to different jobs, just to be able to protect yourself as well. So there are national and provincial Canadian policies, including the Canadian Human Rights Act, which protects citizens from discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, religion, color, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, all of these pieces. So that's protected. And then also the BC Human Rights Code, which protects you in employment from discrimination around these same factors. And then there's a few others that I would encourage you to explore on your own. We don't have time today to get into all of them, but I think it's really important that you start to understand these pieces as you are entering into the Canadian context. So some of those are the Employment Equity Act, the Employment Standards Act, learning a little bit about the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And then the last link that you'll be able to click through when you get the sample of the slides afterwards is some questions that are illegal to ask in interviews, and good to know before you get into them what are and are not okay to be asked. So there's some pieces of information that can't be collected through interview or application. So good to know to be able to protect yourself as you're moving through this process. But hopefully all the companies that you're going to be applying for will be very welcoming and inclusive, and hopefully not ask any of those questions. So I just think this is helpful information for you to check out on your own as well. Okay. So I really would love for you, as we're moving through the next couple parts where we're really going to talk about resumes and cover letters, I really want you to think about how the identity pieces that we've just spoken about can be tied into resume and cover letter, and how you can really use those pieces to show up as a full person who's applying for this role, right? Because I think oftentimes we think like, okay, this is my work life, and then I have my outside of work life, which can be true and can be great, but we really want you to end up in a place that you're going to feel like you can be your whole self. And so that's something that I'd encourage you to think about as we move through here. So, right. So as you're preparing to start writing some applications for Canadian jobs, the first thing to do, really just to get you started, is to take a look at the job description that you're applying for the role that you're applying for, and find some keywords and skills that you're wanting to highlight in your documents. So this Venn diagram is kind of showing you what that could look like for the visual learners like myself out there. So looking at the job description, the employer, thinking about the industry that you're in, and then consider your own motivations, experiences, skills, your unique lived experience, and figure out where there's a little bit of overlap between those pieces. And that's really what you want to focus on in these documents. So some examples of what could be included. I've got them kind of broken down here into a few different categories, just to make it easier to consume. So we've got technical skills, which would be things like, lab or field techniques. If there's specific tools that are used in your industry that you are getting experience with, that's great. Often computer skills are something that are sought after in any job at this point. Professional skills like communication, problem solving, leadership are going to be important for anyone who's going to be joining a team or working with really any other people. some of your specific traits, like having a good work ethic, being adaptable or hardworking, are really important. And then finally, the attitude, right? So being enthusiastic, honest, showing up as your authentic self. And I also want to mention that these categories really come throughout the whole process. So as we're talking about resumes and cover letters, there's some pieces that will fit nicely into these documents, but other pieces might come up later through interviews or might be more implied than explicitly stated. So yes, technical skills could be really easy to list on your resume. Professional skills, they can be communicated in a number of ways, whether it's explicitly on your resume or cover letter, or more just implied through the work that you've done, right? So work ethic, for example, it's like if you can see that this person has got a lot of work experience, that they've got a really great work ethic. And then some of those attitudes can come through maybe in the way that you write your cover letter, but also a lot in the interview phase as well. So there's lots of opportunity for you to show off some of these skills. I also thought it would be helpful to share a little bit about what employers are currently looking for. The list that you can see on the screen right now is actually from about close to 70 employers who were on campus last week for the Spring Career Fair. And this is what they said that they're looking for in particular right now. And I just think it's helpful to be able to show this, and hopefully there's a few of the skills on here that you recognize in yourself and can start to think about how you might want to communicate that to employers. So some of the common skills are, of course, communication, customer and client service experience, problem solving and strategic thinking, being tech savvy, data analysis, and then some of the common qualities there as well. Being willing to learn. So maybe you don't have the direct experience, but you convey through your application that you're excited to learn about something, or that you have experience with learning, right? So for all of you in this room as international students, you have that unique experience of learning in a new environment, potentially learning in a different language, depending on where you're from. So that in itself is going to communicate that willingness to learn and that adaptability and flexibility. That's another thing that they're looking for. Couple others: critical thinking, active listening, and ability to work within diverse groups. So this is just a little bit of a sample of what people could be looking for, but of course you want to rely on the job description to know some more specifics. I also want to mention that if you see some skills here that you don't have, but you would like to explore a little bit more, as UBC students, you have free access to LinkedIn Learning, and there's like 16,000 courses or something like that on there. And a lot of them will touch on these different qualities and skills. So I'd encourage you to explore that if there's something in particular that you're hoping to build within yourself and expand your knowledge in. So once you have a sense of what they are looking for in their potential employee, you could create something that looks a little like this, which I call a story bank, but I think it's a really helpful way to start considering what we might want to communicate to the employer, and then we'll figure out how and when is appropriate to do that. But starting with what they're really looking for. So the examples we've got here are, they're looking for a self-starter, someone who can lead cross-platform social media communications, and someone who can communicate well verbally and in writing with multiple audiences. So reading that job description, what we've done in this example is to think, okay, well, what would this student have done that could be applicable to these pieces, and what would they maybe want to communicate about that? So for self-starter, in this example, started an event series for my club, which means proposing the idea, navigating some complicated policies around room booking, speaking with a caterer, recruiting volunteers, really going out of their way to make something happen. For someone who can lead a cross-platform social media communication piece, maybe you've only done Instagram so far, but that's gone well. So maybe that's something you want to highlight as, this is something I've done, but I want to expand on it more, right? And then, of course, for communicating well verbally and in writing, you could consider a number of different things. This person in this example is using some class projects, so performances to talk about the verbal skills. English, they've done some persuasive essays or research papers, and then pitches in and marketing briefs as well. So just really thinking about like, what are they looking for and what do I have that matches that, just to kind of give yourself a little bit of a primer for how you might actually show up in the role. Okay, and then before we get into resume writing and before I check the chat there in a moment, we're really going to talk about resumes and then cover letters, and hopefully be able to get through all of this in time. Yeah, about half an hour. It's great. So I just wanted to talk about the differences and then also some of the similarities between these two documents. So for resumes, the purpose is really to demonstrate your qualifications, so your skills, experiences, and education in a way that's easy to read for the employer. So 1 to 2 pages, depending on your industry and level of experience. I think definitely okay to have 1 page, especially early on in your career, and you might build upon that as you go, but no more than 2 pages generally for most industries. And that this should be in point form or bullet points. Make it really easy to read through and get a sense of what you've accomplished in each of those roles. And then cover letters paired with resumes explain your motivation and your alignment with the opportunity that you're applying for. So how do your skills, experiences, and education actually relate to the role that you're applying for? These should be no more than 1 page because they're a narrative or in paragraph form. So 1 page is plenty to be able to highlight a couple of experiences or skills that you think are mostly related to that job. But they really do work together. So the goal at the end of the day is that your resume and cover letter are going to work together to tell your story in a persuasive way that makes the employer want to invite you in for an interview and get to know you more. You're really looking to connect your past experiences and your accomplishments to what the employer and the role really need. And they really should be tailored to focus on what is most relevant. So we'll talk a little bit about how to do that for each document as we go through. But that's a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, I'm going to just take a pause, check the chat here. Oh, amazing. LinkedIn Learning. Thank you, Irene. Okay. So for resume writing, actually, let me just ask a question before we get into this. Can you put a Y in the chat if you feel like your resume is amazing, it's ready to go, you could apply for a job right now if you wanted to, and maybe an N in the chat if you feel like, I got some work to do on my resume or I'm not sure where to start. Okay. All right, that's a pretty good mix actually. I just think it's okay, and a YN, I love it. Little unsure. Yes, I could apply, but maybe it could be better. Great. Okay, I just find it helpful to know a little bit about how folks are feeling as we go into this. Amazing. Well, we're going to start with some of the basics before we really dive into it. So, of course, you're going to need to start with a header. So at the top of your resume page, including your first and last name. If you go by a different name at work, you can use your preferred name. I think that's great, whatever you're going to feel most comfortable with your employer calling you. You can include your pronouns if you'd like. That's something that I personally like to do. Including your phone number and or email address. So how do they get in touch with you? And you can also include links to online profiles or portfolios. So many people will, connect to their LinkedIn, or if you have an online portfolio, you can hyperlink that as well. I'll mention hyperlinks a couple times as we go through this. And so I like to also say right off the bat that as you're doing job applications, as you're submitting these, you should always save your application as a PDF and then submit that. So not submitting pages or Word documents. We want to make it really, really easy for the employer to open and read our application. So PDF is the most straightforward way to be able to do that. And you can click through to hyperlinks there. So that's a little caveat for you. In Canada, you don't need to include any highly personal information like citizenship status, your social insurance number, your age, anything like that. We've already talked a little bit about the discrimination policies that exist in Canada, and so we don't need to give any of that information really until there's some pieces like your social insurance number, for example, you may be asked for later in the process once you've secured the job offer and they're going through some HR pieces, then it's common to provide that, but it's not something that's necessary for you to provide on your resume and cover letter. And then generally speaking, in Canada, photos are certainly not required, and I would say best practice not to include them. I personally find that it just takes up a lot of space, and it gives a lot of information about you that maybe will be good for the employer, but also maybe not. And I think it's just good to leave it off of there, unless you feel very strongly. But those are a couple pieces. Here's a couple of examples of what a header could look like. Keep it simple, keep it clean. If you want to include some color, I think that's okay, depending on your industry and what the standards are. But this is just a couple of examples so you can see their name, their phone number, and email. You can include a full address if you'd like. I personally like the just Vancouver, BC or Richmond, BC. And then, of course, linking to websites or LinkedIn as well. So once you've got your name up there, the next part to put in is a highlight of your qualifications. So 3 to 5 reasons that you'd be well suited for the position, and support with each of those reasons as well. So if someone were to only read the first part of your resume and not get through all of it, what would you want them to know about you, right? Like, this is really your chance to give a first impression to the employer, and highlight why they should be interested to learn more about you through your resume and cover letter, and then potentially through an interview. So this could include some pieces around like software, like we talked about before, languages or techniques, soft skills, and character traits. So some of those things that we were talking about before. I think a really great one to include for many of the folks in this room, just as you are international students with that specific experience, is something like cross-cultural communication developed through living in multiple countries or speaking different languages, working with people from different backgrounds, right? So that's like a really great strength that you all have just by nature of your lived experience. So I encourage you to include something like that if it feels true for you. The highlights of qualifications could also be titled as a profile, summary, skills, or something similar. I kind of like the way highlight sounds, but that's just me personally. And I've got some examples here. So you can see there's a bit of a combination of the hard skills and soft skills. So quantitative data analysis demonstrated through 2 years of experience as a research assistant, strong people leadership ability honed during a year-long group project for a capstone course. So I think a combination of those things is really nice. And again, I'd encourage you to match these with what keywords you're seeing in the job description. And really use this area to tailor your resume from one job application to the next. Yes, all of these slides will be available to you after the presentation. We'll send out a recording, the recording of this session and these slides as well. And Irene's just got the attendance there, so that's how you'll get it. Thanks. Yeah, I think it can be helpful to see a couple of these examples as you're writing your own to get a sense of what it could look like. So there's a couple more here, which I won't spend too much time on because we're going to run out, but these will be available afterwards. So take a look through and see what feels like the most helpful for you as well. Okay. Right. And then, of course, you're all UBC students, so you want to communicate your education pieces. So you can include information on any universities or colleges that where you've studied, what that discipline was, when you expect to graduate, if you haven't yet, where is the institution. And then depending on the role that you're applying for, you might think about including some other pieces around your educational experience. So if there are courses or projects, papers, or anything like that that are particularly related to the job that you're applying for, especially if you have a little less work experience, this can be a nice way to sort of bulk up your resume and showcase your genuine interest in the area that you're applying for. So that's one thing that you can consider doing. And then major awards, if you've won any academic awards, I think definitely great to include those. So they just sort of demonstrate that commitment to education, and that can be a green flag for an employer. So if you've got those, that's great. This is just another example of how this could potentially look. So you can see a couple of relevant coursework pieces there, if you're on the Dean's List, that type of thing. And after education, you can do experiences. So thinking about any type of experience that you've had that would be related to this role. So it can be paid or unpaid. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Your experience is experience, but you could consider organizing it in a few different ways depending on what is most relevant to the role and potentially your different industries that you're a part of. So a few options here are to have work versus volunteer experience if it feels important to you to have a distinction between those. I really like the relevant experience and then additional experience. So starting with the things that are really like very easy to connect to the job, and then additional experience would be like, okay, and beyond that, I also have these things that will help, but maybe aren't as directly related. Or you could maybe consider research experience and administrative experience if you're especially applying for academic roles or roles in research. Each one, just tells a bit of a different story. So use the one that feels the most true to your story. And you'll also want to include some detailed description of your accomplishments, or more so than responsibilities in the role, which we're going to talk about next. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of some accomplishment statements. An accomplishment statement is really composed of three parts. So a verb, so the skills that you want to convey, a task, which is what you did and how you did it, and then the result of that. So how do you know that this went well? So just as this example, if we didn't use an accomplishment statement, we can say responsible for preparing content for print, but that doesn't really tell the employer much, like responsible how, right? What does that mean? And to turn that into an accomplishment statement, changing that to composed and published advertising copy, press releases, and letters as part of a fundraising campaign that generated $10,000 in 2 months. It's amazing if you're able to include some of this quantitative information, and also that's not always possible. So qualitative is also great. So for example, for me, I could say developed and delivered content around identity, resume, and cover letter, resulting in increased career confidence from students, something like that, right? So maybe I don't have a specific measurement, but I can still communicate the benefit that I've offered, right? Okay, we've got a couple of other accomplishment statements in here, but I'm just conscious of our time and I want to get to cover letters. So I'll leave this for you to check out when you get the slides afterwards. And I think skip through this part here as well. Okay. And then I also want to chat about formatting for the resume. So I think it's easy to get caught up in the format, and we see often some that look really pretty on Canva or other places on the internet, and those can look lovely, but I really would encourage you to choose something that's simple and easy to read and really showcases your content more than just looks nice. So focus on the content first and then think about how you want to format that in order to better highlight certain parts of your story. So think about everything that you want to include in your application, and then also think about other pieces that maybe don't fit so neatly into those sections that we talked about of highlights, education, and experience, and see if there's another way to include that, whether it's more implied or maybe you talk about it in your cover letter instead. And there's no perfect way to write a resume, so it will vary a little bit by industry and region. So I would also encourage you to check in with professionals within your own industry and see if they have any suggestions as well. And another thing that you can do in terms of making this easy for the employer to read and to see the things that you really want them to see is using some tools like using bold or italics or underline to really emphasize certain parts. I would recommend not using font sizes that are too small. Generally no smaller than 10, because you want to think about, again, there's someone reading this, and so we want to make it really easy for the reader to consume that information and then make a decision about moving us forward in the process. Help the reader find the most relevant information. So we kind of talked about the order that you can put things in, but you can use that order to particularly tailor your resume and or cover letter to a specific job that you're applying for. So think about, do I want my education to be up front for this job application, but maybe towards the bottom for another job application, depending on the content. I think that's a great way to be able to customize your resume. And then, of course, as we talked about before, sticking to 1 to 2 pages. Okay, and we're going to get into cover letter in our last 10 minutes or so here. Hoping to have a couple minutes for questions at the end if we can. Great. So the structure of a cover letter is really, we kind of want to filter down. So we're starting off with who you are and what you're really offering to this company. This is a great place if you'd like to disclose a little bit more about who you are as a person and your personal experiences. This is a really good place to do that. And then talking about your top 2 to 3 skills or experiences that relate specifically to the job. Talking about your story, so examples of your top skills and experiences, and most importantly, talk about how that ties into the particular role that you're applying for, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then ending off with a thank you for reading my application and looking forward to hopefully speaking about this opportunity more with you in person. So kind of requesting that job interview or getting to the next step. So starting with our introduction, introduce yourself. The person reading this wants to get to know who you are. So this is what I was saying. You can talk a little bit about studying or what you're studying, where did you learn about this opportunity? What makes you, this unique human, excited about the role? Like, why are you interested in this employer, interested in this job, in the industry? Talk a little bit about how your journey has led you to want this role. And then which of your couple of skills and experiences would make you an awesome candidate. So kind of hook them in with that information and want to read more about you. I think it's really important that you use your authentic and human voice to capture the reader's attention. This is really the best way for you to get their attention and make them want to learn more about you. So it's important to sound like yourself and be true to who you are as you write this application. For the body paragraph, so you've got your introductory paragraph, and then moving on to the different pieces that you want to focus on. You'll want to connect your skills and experiences to what you know about the role or the company. So there's a couple of examples here. So for this one, I helped foster a culture of inclusion at UBC through organizing community building events for the Pride Collective. I now strive to continue this work at a company that holds inclusion as a core value. I'm inspired by your company's recent progress on this issue and committed to solidifying its position as a leader in this space. So this person is really taking the opportunity to talk a little bit about what their personal experience is or their professional experience is, why they're motivated to continue doing that, and why it's related to this specific company that they're applying for, right? So to do this, we really encourage you to use the STAR method to talk about the relevant details and stay organized in your process. So can I get a Y in the chat if you've heard of the STAR method before, and an N if this is a new method to you? Not heard of it before. Okay, got a bit of a mix. Great. I love this method. I hope that you'll find it helpful. You can also use it in interviews, but we're just talking about cover letters today, but just as a heads up. So this is just a bit of a storytelling formula, really, to help you keep your thoughts organized and hit all those marks to make the story meaningful to the employer. So starting off with our situation, so what was the context of the story that occurred? So working for the Pride Collective, for example, what was the task that you were assigned and what was the problem that you were solving? So what actually did you do? The action, what steps you took to complete the task that you were required to do? the results, so how you know that you did the task well. This could be, again, as we talked about before, quantitative or qualitative pieces. And then most importantly, the most important part, if you remember anything, remember that the relevance is the most important. So make sure to tie that back into the role that you're applying for or to the company that you're applying to work with, right? So why does this specific experience help me to be a better candidate, and how will it support me in doing the job that I'm applying for? So make sure that to go back to that relevance piece. And we'll look at an example here. So before the STAR method, we've got in my last job, doesn't really tell us much. I was responsible for preparing content for print. My writing skills make me suitable for the position of communications coordinator. That's great, but doesn't really tell us much about this applicant, and really could be true for many different people. So using the STAR method can give us a lot more give the employer a lot more information. So as a communications assistant for Gateway Theatre, my role involved preparing materials for an annual fundraising campaign. I wrote advertising copy, press releases, and letters for audiences, including national media outlets, local businesses with a history of supporting the arts, and families who participated in community-based programming. So we're getting a lot of information about what in particular was this person doing. The campaign generated $10,000 in 2 months, which represented a 5% increase over the prior year's campaign. So we can see that this person was effective in doing their role. And lastly, my ability to appeal to diverse stakeholders holds the potential to drive similar results for your organization. So here's what I've done, and here's how it's going to help me in this role. Finally, after you've done a little bit of explaining about your personal story or your professional story, you want to end this off with a reiteration of your interest, your enthusiasm, and what are those key qualifications. You can repeat some of that from the first part of why you would be a good fit. Thank them for considering your application and invite them to contact you for an interview. That personal touch of like, I'm really hoping to hear from you can mean a lot to an employer. And then provide any additional logistical information that might be relevant, like if you're only available for virtual interviews for some reason or something like that, you can include that information, but keep it brief. And lastly, just a note on formatting for the cover letters. Please make sure to use the same header that you have on your resume. These two documents should be look like they are supposed to go together. So make sure that you're using the same fonts and headers on both. You should include the employer's address, and if you have the name of the person that's doing the hiring, that's great to include. If you don't have the name of the person that that is going to be hiring, I think Dear Hiring Manager is a great way to play that safe, so you can do that. And you should include the title of the job or the position number for the role you're applying for. You should be able to find that on a job application or a job description, and make sure that you do that. Again, all of these details just really help to make it easy on the employer's end to be able to hire you as an applicant, or put you through as an applicant to the next stage. And as we talked about, you're writing this in paragraph form rather than bullet points of the resume. But I think it's really important to know that these two documents work in tandem. And so we want them to not only look like they are related, but be telling a story together. Okay, 3:55. That brings us to the end of our time together. I'm hoping to have a little bit of time for questions, which we can do on recording or not. Please make sure to tell us what you learned today by filling out the survey that Irene will be sending out later. So if you haven't already, please make sure to sign in as an attendee, and we'll be following up with the recording of this webinar as well as all of the slides, which will include some further resources here if you'd like some more practice writing accomplishment statements. There's lots of resources about career development. And I would also invite you, if you'd like to meet with an advisor. We have drop-in Monday to Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the UBC Career Center in Brock Hall, or you can book in for an appointment with an advisor to talk about your resume and cover letter. If you get to the interview phase for any of the roles you're applying for, we can help you with that as well. Or if you just want to explore what your career might look like, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. And that brings me to the end of the presentation today. I just want to say thank you so much for your attention and also your participation. I really appreciate all of the content that you put in the chat and being willing to share. So thank you for that. And I hope you found this helpful. And we will hopefully see you on Wednesday for the next event. Okay, thanks so much.